Prophetic Ministry is pleased to present a video message by Dr. Howard C. Estep. What you will see and hear in the next hour has been specially prepared to assist you in your walk with God. It is packed with facts and scriptures. To receive the most from Dr. Estep's message, you should have your Bible, notebook, and pencil ready. Prepare yourself now. Cassette number 6 brings you the final messages in this Bible study lecture series from the book of Daniel. Dr. Howard C. Estep is now teaching from Daniel chapter 11.
If you'll turn in your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 11. We're beginning in verse 5, and we'll go right through verse 31, and that will conclude with Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian king. And then when we pick up in verse 32, we'll continue for 3 or 4 verses with Antiochus, and then we'll pick up later with what happens to the future Antichrist. So in chapter 11, beginning in verse 5, we have an outline for you. 1, the king of the south in verse 5. 2, the league between Egypt and Syria, verse 6. 3, war, divorce, and love, verses 7 through 9. 4, defeat of Antiochus the Great. This was the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. That's verses 10 through 12. 5, Syria and Egypt engage in war, verses 13 through 16. And 6, Antiochus the Great to Antiochus Epiphanes. That's verses 17 through 21. 7, he makes a league with the high priests, verses 22 through 24. And 8, Epiphanes makes war with Ptolemy of Egypt, verses 25-27. And 9, Antiochus returns in great glory, verses 28 through 31. We'll try to make it as interesting as possible. It's history, so we do the best we can. This is chapter 11, beginning in verse 5. We're looking now at the king of the south. Verse 5, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Here we're dealing with Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who seized Egypt on the death of Alexander. You remember in the 8th chapter, King Alexander of Greece died. And then when he died, the 4 generals took over. And those 4 generals eventually evolved into the countries of Greece, Turkey, Syria, and Egypt. So now we're looking at what happened in the country of Egypt way back there after King Alexander had died. And so we see here that Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who seized Egypt on the death of Alexander, king of the north. And then we have Seleucus, one of Alexander's princes and a general who seized Syria, Babylon, and Media, and became greater than Ptolemy of Egypt. Verse 5, and the king of the south. This refers to Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, the founder of the Egyptian division of the Grecian Empire. So you have here the king of the south. This refers to Ptolemy, the king of the south, and it says he shall be strong. He became strong, for he added other countries. When he became king, he only had Egypt. Then he added Phoenicia, which is Lebanon today, Corinth, various other countries in the Mediterranean area, and shall be strong and be one of his princes. This was Seleucus, one of his princes, Seleucus the first, called Nicator the Conqueror, founder of the Seleucid Empire from 312 to 280 BC. And then it goes on to explain some things about him. But one of the princes, and he shall be strong above him. In other words, the princess or the student became stronger than the teacher. He shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So we have here Ptolemy of Egypt, and then from him comes Seleucus, and Seleucus was a student of Ptolemy, And so you have this power struggle in Egypt, something like 280 BC along in there. So you have the king of the south in verse 5. Number 2, there was a league between Egypt and Syria. And you have to carry this in your mind. When King Alexander died, 4 generals took over. And from those 4 generals came Turkey, Syria, Greece, Egypt. That's all you have to remember. 4 things. Turkey, Syria, Greece, Egypt. And that was the then known world. And those 4 generals became a power struggle among themselves. And this was all taking place from 330 some BC when Alexander died, right on up to the time of the Maccabees, right on up to the time of the Roman Empire, which took over about 50 BC, round figures approximately. So now you have a league between Egypt and Syria in verse 6. And in the end of years, and this phrase, in the end of years, could mean after some time or after some years, and some commentators believe about 65 years. And in the end of years, they refers to the king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the north at that time was Syria. The king of the south was Egypt, because you only had the 4 kingdoms: Syria, Turkey, Greece, Egypt. You had the 4. So now you have the king of the north and the king of the south. And bear this in mind, when you're reading Scripture, there is a rule to go by which never alters. All directions in the Bible are in relationship to the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the geographical center of the earth's land surface. That's according to Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 5. So when you read in the Bible, the king of the north or the king of the south, it's north of Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem. Verse 6, we're looking at the league between Egypt and Syria. And in the end of years, some years later, after verse 5, they, the 2 kings, north and south, Syria and Egypt, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. The daughter of the king of the south was named Bernice. She shall not retain the power of the arm. In other words, she shall not be powerful to the point that she'll be able to sway the king of the north completely. Neither shall he stand nor his arm. So here you have these kings with their sons and their families trying to attain to great power in the Middle East, bearing out what's going on today, because that part of the world never changes. So you have the daughter of the king of the south trying to influence the king of the north. There's a marriage or an intended marriage. We find as one person is poisoned and then another person goes on the throne. You see, human nature never changes. We're looking at verse 6, the middle of verse 6. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, predicting the death of Antiochus II. Neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up. Bernice was divorced. She didn't make the successful stand that she thought she was going to make when she left her father, king of the south, went to the king of the north, proposed a marriage circumstance. It didn't work out, but she shall be given up. And they that brought her, the Egyptian women who accompanied Bernice from Egypt, strove to defend her when she was murdered. And many were killed because of this situation that prevailed at that time. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. This refers to her own father, who gave her to Antiochus for a wife. So you can see the king of the south gives his daughter to the king of the north, and then the king of the north is poisoned, and then the wife leaves. You see the intrigue that happens? You see, all of these things are tied in politically. And we have to, when we read the Scripture, we can't just read verses and say, oh, well, that's that. That's dull, doesn't mean anything. You have to look behind the scenes to see what's going on. So we have a league between Egypt and Syria, way back there about 280 BC after Alexander had died, and we see the thing didn't prosper. Didn't work out at all. Our third part, war, divorce, and love. This is verses 7 through 9. And we look at verse 7. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate. A branch of the same roots from which Bernice sprang. She came from the king of the south. Her brother Ptolemy the third, who had just succeeded to the Egyptian throne, a once invaded Seleucid realm to avenge his sister who was murdered at Antioch. In verse 6, his sister was murdered. Now he rises up, her brother, so he's going to try to avenge her death. This is all here in verse 7. And out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north. So this brother of the south, Ptolemy the third, is going to march on Syria, and he's going to enter into the fortress of the king of the north. And this was Seleucus, the second son of Laos, who suffered defeat by Ptolemy the third. He not only entered into the fortress of the king of the north, but plundered, and then it gives a list of the towns and the countries and the areas that he plundered, even to the borders of India. So you can see war. War simply because a girl from her father in the south, who was king of Egypt, goes north, marries the Syrian king, and all of this trouble. Merely because war, divorce, and love. And you'll notice the latter part of verse 7. It says, and shall deal against them and shall not prevail. Verse 8. And shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So at this point, so far in our lesson, we have seen nothing but one nation against another nation, and it all started when King Alexander died, and he gave his kingdom over to 4 of his generals, or at least 4 of his generals took over. Verse 9. So the king of the south, still referring to the king of Egypt, and the king of the south shall come into his kingdom. Come into the kingdom of Seleucus the second, and this refers to a second invasion of Syria. But having heard of rebellion in Egypt, Ptolemy the third returned there to suppress it. Otherwise, he would have wholly destroyed the kingdom of Syria. So the king of the south shall come unto his kingdom, and shall return unto his own land. So here we have war, divorce, and love. Doesn't sound much like the Bible, does it? It sounds like a Hollywood production, really. Let's look at the fourth point, defeat of Antiochus the Great, and this is in verses 10 through 12. This is the defeat of Antiochus the Great by Ptolemy the third of Egypt. Verse 10, but his sons shall be stirred up. The families of these men who are killed, who are slaughtered, the families are stirred up. But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. In other words, the sons of Seleucus the second and Seleucus the third and Antiochus the third, called the Great, did assemble a great multitude of forces to recover his father's dominions, but was poisoned by 2 of his own generals after a reign of 2 years. But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Verse 11, and the king of the south, going back to the king of Egypt, the king of the south, Ptolemy, the king of the south, Ptolemy, shall be moved with choler. This is fear anger, disgust, and shall come forth and fight with him, even the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. This took place about 221, 204 BC, in the time of the Maccabees. If you are a student of ancient history of that part of the world, the Maccabean rule, long about that time, 221, 204. Then a man by the name of Antiochus the Great of Syria declared war about 219 BC, and Philopator defeated Antiochus in the battle near Gaza, 217 BC, and he became greatly exalted, destroying and oppressing many of his own land, especially the Jews. So the Jews were persecuted back there about 200 BC in the days of the Maccabeans. They were tremendously persecuted. We're looking at the defeat of Antiochus the Great, verses 10 through 12, verse 11. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, so forth, verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. In other words, he'll not be successful. He'll not be successful. He was not to be strengthened by his victories due to the constant decline of his kingdom brought about by permitting favorites to rule or to ruin. In other words, as the king was away fighting, back on home base, those in charge back there weren't really taking care of the kingdom. And the kingdom was diminishing. And this is what he's talking about here in verse 12. And he shall cast down many 10,000s. Yes, he shall be famous, or he shall be successful in his wars, but the latter part of that verse, but he shall not be strengthened by it. In other words, at the home base, he'll be weakened. And just as this king, in verse 12, went away and became involved in a war, his home base began to diminish. And this is so true. And it all goes back to a principle. And the principle is this: first things first. You have to keep your mind on the first things first. Whatever is the first prerequisite in your life, that's the thing that should get most attention. And to Christians, that's God. That's serving the Lord. That should have number one place or number one priority in all of our lives. It's a principle that never changes, though it's the king of the south fighting against the king of the north in the 11th chapter of Daniel, or it's John Doe living here in Southern California. It doesn't matter. The principle is the same. The characters are different, but the principles are the same. We have now in the fifth part of our lesson, when we look at Syria and Egypt engage in a war in verses 13 through 16, this is Antiochus the Great, who is the Syrian king in the north, renews the war after 14 years and defeats Ptolemy the fifth of Egypt. See, it was Ptolemy the second. Now we're dealing with Antiochus the Great, who was the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now he is dealing with the king in the south, who is Ptolemy the fifth, who is the king of Egypt. Verse 13. For the king of the north, this is Antiochus the third, called the Great, and he ruled in Syria from 223 to 187 BC. 14 years after his defeat, he returned to fight the Egyptians with a greater army than before and with many riches from his campaign in restoring the eastern parts of his empire. Verse 13. For the king of the north, this is Antiochus III, shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain wars with a great army and with much riches. Verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. He's talking about Ptolemy the fifth, called Epiphanes the Illustrious. He was 5 years old at this time. When Philopator died, Rome for the first time interfered to make Antiochus surrender his conquests. Not daring to disobey Rome, Antiochus made peace with Ptolemy and betrothed to him his daughter Cleopatra. This is about 193 BC. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south, also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves. When we're talking about the robbers of thy people, the Jews who rejected their religion and joined Ptolemy under Scopas, the Egyptian general, defeated by Antiochus the Great about 198 BC. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Verse 15. So, the king of the north. We mentioned the king of the north in verse 13. Now we're back in 15. So the king of the north shall come. This refers to Antiochus the Great coming to recover Judea. And in so doing, he defeated Scopas, taking several fenced cities, and none of the Egyptian generals were able to oppose him. Verse 15. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. The soldiers in the south will not be able to stop him. Neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Verse 16. But he that cometh against him, this refers to Antiochus the Great coming against Ptolemy and doing as he pleased in conquest. Verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land. Antiochus the Great was helped by the Jews, who supplied him with provisions and assisted him in reducing the garrison of Scopas in the citadel at Jerusalem. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Palestine was greatly reduced to poverty through the long wars. Our sixth point, this is verses 17 through 21. Antiochus the Great and Ptolemy the Fifth come to terms. Antiochus, this is in Syria, gives Ptolemy, this is the king of the south in Egypt, his daughter, who later helps her husband defeat the plans of Antiochus. Isn't it amazing? They bring a woman into the scene, and this woman very cunningly works, and she gets everything, but it's for her father. She's not working in the interest of her husband. This is verses 17 through 21. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom. This is Antiochus the Great, had purposed to march into Egypt, but chose instead to make a covenant of peace with Ptolemy, giving him his own daughter Cleopatra. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom. He was planning on putting the combined army of his kingdom against the king of the south, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women. This term denotes the beauty of this lovely daughter of his, Cleopatra. The beauty of women, he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. Antiochus planned to corrupt Cleopatra, causing her to be a snare to Ptolemy, but instead she helped her husband and put him on guard against her father. Middle of verse 17. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. So the daughter was still pledged to her father. She was not pledged to her husband, though she was entering into a marriage contract with him. Antiochus next makes war on Greece, but is turned back by the Roman prince, who defeats him near Smyrna on the western shores of the Mediterranean in Turkey. Verse 18. After this, And this refers to the Roman consul who defeated Antiochus, causing him to withdraw from Greece to Asia. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. He's going to turn his face unto the isles after making peace with Egypt. Antiochus the Great fitted out a great fleet of ships. They had a navy in that day. Subdued most of the maritime places on the coast of the Mediterranean, and took many islands. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. This refers to the Roman consul who defeated Antiochus, causing him to withdraw from Greece to Asia. The Romans then defeated him in Asia Minor, compelling him to abandon all the country north of Tarsus. Thus the reproach Antiochus planned to cause Rome to suffer was turned against him, or upon himself. Middle of verse 18. But a prince for his own shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Verse 19, then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, and he shall stumble and fall and not be found. This refers to Antiochus the Great turning back to his own fort in Antioch. He was obliged to raise 15,000 talents for Rome to pay for the war, so he marched into his eastern province to extract the unpaid taxes and perished in a war about 187 BC, according to verse 19. Seleucus, in verse 20, the son of Antiochus the Great, sends a man to plunder the temple at Jerusalem and extract money from Israel. This is recorded in the book of Maccabees. So we look at verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate. In other words, in the place of the man who died, there shall stand up in his place or in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. In other words, in those days, to pay for a war, they merely raised the taxes. And then they sent a prince or a relative of the king into the country. And this king started an additional office of government, and they severely extracted taxes from the peoples in those countries to help pay for the wars. And this is how it brought on slavery, and how the people were subdued by trying to raise the money for those taxes, because people didn't have money in those days. So they had to sell their flocks, their herds, their crops, and that was the way they had their yearly living or their earnings for the year. But they had to sell that to pay for the taxes, or make money for the taxes in order to pay for the kings who were engaged in war. This is verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days. But within a few days, this perhaps refers to his quick death from the time he sought to plunder the Jewish temple at Jerusalem to get the money deposited there, which is here called the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person. Now we have a historical facsimile of the future Antichrist. And this is pretty well agreed upon by many Bible students, that when you're studying Bible prophecy, you will find a historical fulfillment, and then you'll find a prophetical fulfillment. Many times, the historical fulfillment will lead astray people who are trying to interpret the Bible, and they don't see the future fulfillment. And that's why you hear sometimes men make the statement, or you hear people say that my pastor doesn't believe in Revelation because he says it's all filled or all fulfilled. Or my pastor doesn't teach the book of Daniel because he believes it's all fulfilled. He's looking at the historical fulfillment, not the future fulfillment. So here enters upon the scene a man known in the Bible as a vile person. Who was he? Antiochus Epiphanes. His father, Antiochus the Great. And they all came from Syria. Syria was one of the countries that evolved out of the Alexandrian Empire. And so what about this man, Antiochus Epiphanes? Verse 21. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. From verse 21 through 34 refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Syrian king. We're looking now at verses 22 through 24. And this man Epiphanes, a forerunner of the Antichrist, who lived about 185, 175 BC along in that immediate area, we find him making a league with the high priests of Judaism. This is in verses 22 through 24. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Who's the prince of the covenant? Not only were his competitors overthrown, but the high priests. The high priests in Israel joined in with this fellow. And their authority was taken away from them. And we find that these priests gave large sums of money. It was much like bribing people in those days. The same thing as we would call a bribe today. Verse 22. Yea, also the prince of the covenant, 23. And after the league made with him, the agreement between Antiochus Epiphanes and a man called Jason, Jason, after this agreement was broken, and Antiochus put wicked Melinus in the position of high priest, because he offered him more money than Jason did. Thus he acted deceitful in his agreement with Jason. So we have back there, almost 200 years BC, a strong Syrian king, Antiochus Epiphanes, going down into the land of Palestine, what we call the state of Israel today, and we find him entering into a league with people who are in charge of the worship of Judaism in the temple. And mind you, this is the second temple. The first temple was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar invaded that part of the world about 600 BC. Then 530 BC approximately, Cyrus, king of Persia, allowed 50,000 Jews to go back to Palestine, and they rebuilt a smaller temple. And it's this second temple that all of this affair is taking place in, and especially this very vile person known as Antiochus Epiphanes, and you'll see what he does in just a few moments. Verse 23, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. With a few people, he'll be successful. And so Antiochus Epiphanes had a small following. According to verse 23, become strong with a small people. 24, he shall enter peacefully, even upon the fattest places of the province. After becoming king, Antiochus Epiphanes laid claim to Palestine and to Phoenicia. What's Phoenicia? That's modern Lebanon. That's all up and down the Mediterranean coast. Then a war broke out between Syria and Egypt all over again in verse 23, as we just read. Now verse 24. He shall enter peacefully, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done. What's he referring to? This refers to the policy of Antiochus in dividing the spoils of war among his friends and subjects, as well as his own revenues. He spent much in public show, and in many ways manifesting his liberality more than all other kings before him. He would even go out in the street and throw handfuls of money in the street. So this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, he wanted to be popular. He wanted to be well liked. Though he was a powerful soldier, general, king of Syria, he wanted to have real power with the people. So he did something that his fathers did not do, the middle of verse 24, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and the spoil, and the riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Antiochus planned in various ways to prevent an invasion of his kingdom by Egypt, and strengthened the strongholds of defense on his borders while making preparations for a war on Egypt. This he did for a time, according to verse 24. The first thing I do of a morning when I come to my office is read the morning paper. It's just like reading the modern version of the book of Daniel. When you understand what has gone on before, and you see what is going on today, you see almost a repeat today of what went on over 2,000 years ago. It's amazing. This fellow Epiphanes, he makes war against Ptolemy of Egypt in verses 25 through 27. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, two armies coming together, one from the south, one from the north. But he shall not stand, meaning to say he'll not be successful in his, because things are going to happen. Ptolemy was taken prisoner in the war. Antiochus had himself made king of Egypt. Sounds like today. Antiochus Epiphanes is king of Syria. He wins the war over the Egyptian army. He takes Ptolemy prisoner, and then he has himself also made king of Egypt. And this is what is saying in verse 25. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great mighty army, and he shall not stand. The king of the south shall not be successful. He shall not stand. Verse 26, yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him. His own friends in Egypt helped to destroy the king of the south. This sounds like the prophecy of Christ. Yea, my own familiar friend hath eaten of my meat. Christ talking about Judas. Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They didn't trust each other. They weren't planning anything that was of benefit to each other. And they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, and yet the end shall be at the time appointed. The deceitfulness of Antiochus Epiphanes destroyed Ptolemy of Egypt. Then after the war in Egypt, when Epiphanes had been successful, then he goes back to his homeland, and this is verses 28 through 31, verse 28. Then shall he return into his land with great riches. Antiochus returns in glory and victory, and sets his heart to break his Jewish covenant and plunder Palestine. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. It's amazing, but these different countries outside of Israel, even 2,000 years ago, were against the Jews. This Syrian king, who had been successful down in Egypt, when he goes back to his own land, he begins to devise means and ways and methods of destroying the Jews who lived there in Jerusalem and in Judea and that part of the world. And that's what it's saying in verse 28. And so he leads a second expedition into Egypt, but is turned back by a mandate from Rome and leagued with Cyprus. He then returns against the Jews, and many apostate Jews help him to pollute the temple and place the abomination of desolation which was a pig on the temple altar, desecrated the temple. We get this in verses 29 through 31. Notice carefully. We're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian king. At the time appointed, Antiochus Epiphanes makes a second invasion of Egypt. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. He's up in the north in Syria. But it shall not be as the former. In other words, he'll not be as successful this time as he was the first time. Verse 30, for the ships of Chittim shall come against him. The reason given here for Antiochus not continuing his war on Egypt is the ships of Chittim coming against him. And this refers to the Romans who ordered him to cease his war on his two nephews. And the Antiochus said he would consult with his friends, but the Roman legate, the navy, drew a circle around him, demanding that he give his answer before stepping out of the circle. Antiochus yielded to the Roman demand and left the country after being within 7 miles of Alexander in Egypt. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Verse 30, the ships of Chittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved. Naturally, the Roman navy stopped him. He shall be grieved and return. While in Egypt, he received bad news, and so he returns to his country. And then he decided to have, in the middle of verse 30, have indignation against the Holy Covenant. He became angry with the Jews. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant, because there were Jews who were apostate, Jews who were not true Jews. They were actually enemies to Judaism, and they agreed to follow Epiphanes in his conniving. And this is brought out here in verse 30. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant, and arms shall stand on his part. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now this is not the same as cutting off the daily sacrifice and setting up the abomination by the future Antichrist, but this is a historical stopping of the daily sacrifice. In this particular circumstance, Antiochus Epiphanes went into the Jewish temple, and he roasted a pig on the altar. Now, if he had roasted a lamb or a sheep or something like that, or a goat, they might have forgiven him. But to roast a pig, a swine, he really stooped to the depth of degradation to humiliate the Jews. And so he roasted a pig upon the altar, and he became known as the abomination of desolation. That's why you read in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 15, when you shall see the abomination of desolation. Matthew evidently read the book of Daniel. And in reading the book of Daniel, Matthew picked up this phrase, abomination of desolation, or the abomination that maketh desolate. He picked it up, and in his prophecy of the future Antichrist, he mentions that by saying, when you see the abomination of desolation, stand in the holy place. Now, he's not referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, but Matthew is referring to the time when the future Antichrist will go into the Jewish temple, and he will stop the Jewish worship and the Jewish sacrifices, because once Israel gets her temple back, then she's going to start offering sacrifices again, much like she did in early Bible times. But she doesn't have a temple now, so she doesn't have any sacrifices. Showing that there has to be the rebuilding of the temple, which will be the fourth temple. And it will be when the fourth temple is built that the future Antichrist, Matthew identifies him as the abomination of desolation, will go into that temple and he will desecrate the temple. He may do something similar to what Epiphanes did. But above all, he's going to go a step further. He's going to tell the world that he is God. And that's supported in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. He's going to tell the world that he is God. He's going to take the place of Almighty God. So if you haven't gotten anything out of the lesson except to realize that in all of these hundreds of years of time, the people over in that part of the world still have malice and greed and distrust and cunningness, and this is in their hearts. And they are constantly conniving one against the other. That's why I say that that part of the world will never change. That part of the world will never change. It can't. God's perfect will is being worked out. And we're fast coming to a conclusion of this day and age, and it looks like the book of Daniel has been placed in the Bible as a primer for Bible prophecy, that we who are interested in studying the Scriptures and trying to really get to the depth of the thing can grasp and realize beyond a shadow of doubt that we're living in the last days. There's no other solution to the problems of this world except the second advent of Jesus Christ. Things aren't just happening. God is allowing, permitting the mastermind of this world system to lead this world on to an international suicide. This world system is going as fast as it can toward an international suicide when Jesus Christ will return from heaven in great and mighty power on the plains of Megiddo, and he will meet the forces of Antichrist, and the Bible says that the armies of this world will be destroyed, and the blood will run up to the horses' bridles, a figure of speech saying that it's going to be a tremendous slaughter. And the world is going there just as fast as it can possibly go.
Decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. Still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back. Behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back.
You will hear the completion of this lecture series from Daniel on the other side of the cassette.